Good morning, friends. This morning we have a very interesting talk about the lives of a few prominent members, I would say, of Central Meeting. Beside me is one of some of the people we're going to talk about, and the talk, of course, is going to be given by Graham Davey. So, Graham, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Ray. Am I heard clearly? Good. I'm going to just give a little bit of background to the work which has gone on investigating the experiences of conscientious objectors during the First World War, and then a summary of what the two brothers, Sidney and Roland Reinge, actually experienced during those 3 years, and finally a few comments about the record which we have from Roland. A man who's done, I think, more than anybody to research the experiences of conscientious objectors is Cyril Pearce of Huddersfield. And he took a special interest in Bristol and investigated a number of conscientious objectors in Bristol. The total number he discovered in the country of people who, men of course, who resisted and opposed the First World War is about 20,000. And of these, there were some 350 in Bristol. And of those 350, 86 were Quakers, either before the war or they became Quakers during and after the war. Now, those numbers may sound quite significant, but I've just looked up the total size of the British Army in November 1918 was 3.8 million. So it's only a tiny minority of the population who resisted the calls to volunteer, to enlist, and were not so overcome by patriotism and a sense of duty that they could say, this war is wrong, I will have nothing to do with it. The interest in opposition to the war, I think, was very much stimulated by a subgroup of the Bristol Radical History group. The subgroup was called Remembering the Real World War I. And it was prompted to act by a government announcement somewhere around 2012 about commemorating the centenary of the start of the First World War. And it was pretty clear that all the emphasis was going to be on military achievements and sacrifice and all the rest of it. And there was going to be very little attention paid to those who objected and either served in alternative ways or were absolutists and refused to serve the military machine in any way. So information was gathered. Roger Angerson, custodian of records, supplied more information. And of the 86 Quakers who were conscientious objectors, we had their names, addresses, occupations, and the meeting they attended. I wrote an article in the Area Meeting newsletter in 2016, giving this information and listing the names of the Quaker conscientious objectors and asking for any further information which people had. And Paul Reinge responded and gave me a copy of the account which Roland had written, which I've read with great interest more than once. Paul is the son of Sidney Reinge. So we're talking about two brothers, Roland and Sidney. Roland, I think, was born 1894 or 1895, and Sidney was 2 years younger. The family lived at 27 Oxford Street. There are 3 Oxford Streets in Bristol. This one runs parallel to the Wells Road from the Three Lamps up to what is called the Bush, or used to be called the Bush, where the Wells Road bends to the left. And then Oxford Street goes down parallel to the start of St. John's Lane, nearly to Perrott's Park, to Victoria Park. It's the road where Stephen Petter used to live before he moved to Rickatts Road. And I went down there fairly recently to see if number 27 was still standing, because a quarter of the houses in Oxford Street were demolished in the 1970s to make room for the Outer Circuit Road, which was never built. And quite close to Tesco Express, the remaining terrace of artisan houses pre-First World War is still standing. And number 27 is the second one from the end. So it's still there and it's been well looked after. It looks very smart. Hasn't yet got a blue plaque on it, but I was very pleased to see that the family home of the Reinge family was still there and being well looked after. I was also interested because when Valerie and I came back from Tanzania in the end of 1968, my father was alive then, living at home, and he could babysit for our 2 very young twin daughters. So Valerie and I went down to what was then called Friars Meeting, and I can just about remember Sidney and Roland. I don't remember Sidney. He was a big man. I don't remember him ever ministering, but Roland certainly did. And I remember one fairly ordinary ministry which he offered, but it finished with a sentence which was a savage indictment of the slaughter that he'd known about in the First World War. He starts his memoir with the words, "My boyhood days are full of happy recollections." And it was quite clearly a happy home. He had good, supportive, loving parents. I think the boys were closer probably to their father than they were to their mother. Mother was very much peace-loving and exhorted them not to fight other boys at school, or indeed fight each other. And they thought that was rather weak and cowardly. But that was her attitude, which she expressed more than once. Father was very good in helping them to make cages for various pet animals, join in their games, and take them for walks, sharing all the information he knew about the countryside and indeed about the city of Bristol as well. So they were happy at home. Roland was not particularly happy at school. He describes himself as being backward in every subject except drawing. But he stayed on at school a bit above the school leaving age and left when he was 14 years and 9 months, and started a 6-year apprenticeship with builders in Guinea Street, just off Redcliffe Hill. And looking back on it, he says he had a good training and worked as a carpenter eventually. And then, of course, August 1914, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and the declaration of war. And he writes a rather surprising sentence: "Uncertainty, fear and horror were in the minds of everyone. Well, we know that a lot of people welcome the war. Thank God who has matched us to this hour, wrote Rupert Brooke. But Rowland seems to have had different experience, and at least some of the people he knew could foresee the horrors that were going to come. The same day that war was announced, he determined that evening that he would have no part in it. I guess that Sidney did as well. That was the line they were going to take. They were both subjected, as all young men were, to endless calls and pressure to volunteer from many different sources, not least the churches. And it was much more, of course, a church-going age at that time. Sidney and Rowland went to the Methodist chapel in Oxford Street, and the minister and the Sunday school teacher there, rather than exhorting them to follow Christ's teaching, were trying to get them to join up and start killing people. There was hostility from neighbors, former friends, and men at work, except for one man, a plumber, who was either atheist or agnostic, and he supported Sidney and Rowland in their stand. The Derby scheme required men of fighting age to attest. That means a statement, a promise that they would undertake service to the nation when called upon. And a detective sergeant called at the family home and was told by Sidney and Rowland that they would not attest in any way. And their mother remonstrated with this detective sergeant, citing Jesus's teaching, a mother's care for her sons from cradle to grave, and suffering and misery caused by war. So she took on this police officer and argued her pacifist case. Their father gave them both a serious warning of the consequences of breaking military law if and when conscription came in. And he asked each son to decide individually whether they were going to enlist or be conscientious objectors, and assured them that they would get his continued love and support, whatever decision they made. And then January 1916, Sidney and Rowland were now at work as adults. But in January 1916, the Military Service Act introduced conscription, and they were called to a tribunal which was held in the council house at the top of Corn Street, to hear their appeal. They found, I think, this tribunal quite demanding. And the next morning, they received a letter telling them that they had been granted conditional exemption. Those were the days when we had a postal service. The event took place on one day, and you got a letter with the result the following morning. The brothers appealed for absolute exemption. And as I say, they got this conditional exemption, but no condition was actually stated. They both feared being pressed to substitute for another worker, and they refused to do that because this would have allowed someone else then to be enlisted. So it was a very clear decision they made and position that they held. Interesting that the military representative on the tribunal accepted their sincerity and was at least partially convinced by the case they were making, whereas the stodgy old civic aldermen and councillors who formed the rest of the tribunal, having never experienced war, of course, found it more difficult to accept their position. In November, December of 1916, their exemption was reviewed, and a second tribunal hearing took place, calling for a change of occupation. I said Sydney was working, I think, for a grocer in a warehouse, and Roland was working as a carpenter. They both refused, though they were given 2 periods for reconsideration. And then their exemption was withdrawn, and they were now liable to be arrested. Detective and constables came to arrest them 4 days before Christmas, 21st of December. And they were taken to Knoll Police Station. You'll be relieved to hear that Knoll Police Station still stands at the end of Calcutta Road, but it was converted into flats a long time ago. But the original brick building is still there. A warrant was queried because they had a letter from the tribunal calling them back the next day. So they were then released, and they made contact with Mabel Tothill of Rosemary Street. Mabel Tothill was a remarkable woman, and there's a separate little booklet about her written by June Hannum, I think, of the Bristol Radical History Group. And she took on, she was a Quaker, living virtually next to, a few yards away from Quakers Friars. And Paul thinks she attended at Redland. I think it's much more likely that as her home was used to give support to conscientious objectors, she was, I think, almost certainly connected with Friars Meeting. Well, they went to the tribunal. Their appeal was immediately dismissed. And she suggested this is Mabel Tothill suggested they spend the next day away from home on the assumption that the police wouldn't dream of coming and arresting them so close to Christmas. Well, that didn't work. The police arrived at about 6 o'clock in the morning before they could have breakfast and leave home. So they lost that little trick. Roland writes that Katie, his sister, prepared breakfast. It was a rather somber meal because the police were waiting, and then escorted to Knoll Police Station again to hand over their possessions and be searched. They went in a horse-drawn black Maria to Bridewell and put in cells there. And then the magistrate's court, they were found guilty of desertion and fined £2, which is quite a lot of money in 1916, but it was never collected from them. They then had a military escort to the recruiting office in Narrow Wine Street, where an officer tried to persuade them to change their minds. And there were devious attempts to get them to accept money. They spent 7 or 8 days in Horfield Barracks and talked with soldiers who had been on the Western Front. And the soldiers showed their kindness and shared Christmas presents they had. And then right at the end of December 1916, they were taken to Chiseldon Army Camp, ordered to put on a uniform, which was placed in front of them. They refused, and they were therefore guilty of insubordination. There followed a court-martial early in January after an army chaplain had tried to persuade them. And then next day, they were sentenced to 112 days in prison with hard labor. And the process of giving the sentence was all done with military ceremonial. He says several hundred soldiers were drawn up in the army camp on three sides of a square, and Roland and Sidney had to stand in the fourth side while this sentence was read out to them. Roland says they were both in civilian clothes, of course, with bowler hats. So there was an element of comedy about this military procedure. They had to serve it in a civilian prison. Roland thinks, probably quite rightly, that this was to avoid conscientious objectors mixing with trained soldiers who were simply on leave for a short time, and perhaps influencing them to follow their example. So they were taken off and escorted to Wormwood Scrubs. On the way to the prison, a woman intercepted them and asked for their address so that she could send a letter to their mother. What a thoughtful action. Perhaps she'd done it before. They were examined for birthmarks, scars, had a bath, and then prison clothes. In those days, with the broad upward pointing arrows all over them. And then put in the cells. Erwin James, who used to write on criminal justice issues for The Guardian, told a story once about how a newly qualified prison officer was being taken around the prison by his colleagues, who persuaded him to go into an empty cell to look at something. While he was in and they were outside, they shut the door and turned the key. And this young, newly qualified officer immediately started shouting and hammering on the door. And the message which Erwin James was getting across pretty effectively was never underestimate the effect on an ordinary human being of being locked into a small space for any length of time. But they had to put up with that. And the conditions were much less humane than they are now. You could complain about them now, but my goodness, in 1916, first month in solitary confinement, if they tried to look out of the window or tried to speak to another prisoner, that could result in punishment, which is additional sentence added on by the governor. They can't do that now. You spent 2 weeks sleeping on boards, then a hard mattress, no letters in or out for 2 months, and then one after 6 weeks, and then one a month. And there was a similar delay before the first visit of any member of your family. And this was done with the prisoner on one side of a corridor, looking through a window, a gauze window, and the visitor on the other side of the corridor, also looking and speaking through a gauze window, and a prison officer in the corridor itself, listening to every detail of the conversation. The food was inadequate in both quantity and quality, no milk or sugar, And they started off on the type A diet. There were 3 levels of diet. I don't think the top one was particularly good, but the bottom one was just one small step up from bread and water, literally bread and water, which was the punishment diet. So they started on that. The work was sewing mail bags. They could have done work on sandbags and other military equipment, but naturally they refused. And for the first time, Roland, having been a Methodist, registered as a Quaker in Wormwood Scrubs, possibly influenced by Mabel Totto. Huh? The ministry by the chaplain and chapel services was equally unsatisfactory, so the 2 brothers arranged a quiet time on Saturday evenings with the family praying for each other. And on some Sunday evenings, they heard hymns singing coming from outside the prison, where supporters had gathered in order to sing hymns and show their solidarity with the prisoners inside. When they'd served their term of 112 days, normally, of course, when a prisoner fulfills their sentence, they are released. They have their own clothes returned to them. They go out through the door and they are free. For conscientious objectors, that was not the case. And as they reached the date of their release, they were then picked up by a military escort and taken back to the army camp, where the whole performance started again. They had expected, because there were 2 of them, a military escort of 3, but it was just one sergeant who felt outnumbered and tried to throw his weight around and ordered them to march in single file and so on, and was generally pretty unpleasant. But when they explained to him that they were not going to obey any form of military discipline, but equally had no intention of trying to escape, his attitude changed completely. And while they were still in London, he asked them if they had any relatives nearby. And they said yes. Would you like to make a visit, paying all expenses? Yes. So they went to Aunt Cassie. I don't know who she was, but she knew them well. And these 3 men turned up on her doorstep quite unexpectedly, but she still managed, with the rigors of wartime, to provide a meal for them, and they had a very pleasant chat. A second visit was offered, and they went to see Uncle Tom and Aunt Harriet and had a pleasant chat with them. All this meant that they didn't get the train from Paddington back to Swindon until it was the last train. When they got to Swindon, the bus going to the army camp was full, so they had to take a taxi. On getting back into Chiselhurst camp, they were much impressed by the quality of the food. All the soldiers complained about the food, but compared with what they had had to put up with in prison, it was a very welcome change. They had varied responses from the soldiers on this occasion, some giving them support and gifts of cigarettes and things like that, to others offering only abusive hostility. Once again, they were ordered to put on a uniform. Once again, they refused. And this time, in the reading out procedure of delivering the sentence, they got a sentence of 1 year. Interesting, at that point, they had a conversation with what Roland describes as a high-ranking officer who listened with interest to their explanation of their actions and was obviously keen to understand. I don't think they converted him, but at least he took them seriously. This time they were going to spend their year at Winchester Prison. They had an escort of 3 and the usual routine of solitary confinement, the aid, diet, and restricted letters and visits. They had a visit from the prison chaplain, who made sneering comments to them about conscientious objectors and Quakers. And then Roland was caught talking to Sidney, and the governor imposed a sentence of 3 days in the punishment cells. That would have been on literally bread and water, and loss of remission marks. Now, Roland was much more concerned about the loss of remission marks because this meant he would be released a day later than Sidney, and they've always been together through this ordeal. In fact, when the time eventually came for them to be released, Sidney and his escort waited overnight, and they were in fact released together, Roland having his extra day. Roland says he switched to carpentry work, on which he had been trained. And if the governor was not walking around, he was able to talk with other prisoners doing similar work, which made life more bearable. The warders, as they were called then, were not universally hostile, and one warder came unexpectedly to Roland with a message from Sidney inquiring after Roland's health. The lack of exercise, the poor food, lack of sleep, of course, made him probably look unwell. So there was a friendly gesture allowing communication between 2 brothers who otherwise wouldn't see each other. In Winchester Prison, their sentences were commuted to 6 months from 1 year. And as I've said, that sounds good. In fact, it was a punishment, because after 6 months, they were released, they were escorted back to camp, and then they'd be committed to prison again and have to go through the same punishing routine of no comfortable mattress and lousy food and all the rest of it. When they were released, this is now after 6 months, they were allowed to have a restaurant meal, because they were then technically free men, of course. And it was suggested they ought to look a bit smarter before they go into a restaurant, and were shaved by a woman. That must have been a quite new and perhaps frightening experience, but all the men were at the front, so shaving men had to be done by a woman, probably with a cutthroat razor. I don't know when safety razors came in. This time they were escorted to Sutton Veny camp, and their writing materials were removed, and they were placed in cells. They made vigorous protests about this because they were still technically free men, just taken to an army camp. And then the commanding officer was very hostile to their protests about this, being put in cells when they hadn't technically committed any crime. But then his attitude changed when he received what he called a solicitor's letter inquiring after them. Now, Rowland thinks that that was in fact either a direct letter from Mabel Tothill or a letter from a solicitor who she had been prompted to write. So all the time behind the scenes, Mabel Tothill is keeping prisoners in touch with their families and giving them whatever support she could. The overcrowding of civilian prisons with conscientious objectors led to the Home Office scheme, whereby conscientious objectors were moved to centres where they would do non-military work under civilian control. Well, at the moment they're in this Sutton Veny camp. They have their third court-martial, and this time it's a sentence of 2 years in prison with hard labour. And they were taken by armed escort this time to Shepton Mallet prison. This is the third prison they've been in, and the usual procedure on starting the sentence. The law had been changed, and they should have been allowed to associate with other prisoners right from the beginning. And when they were not, they protested about this, and it actually reached the House of Commons. And there's a reference in Hansard to the protest of these two Reinge brothers who were not being treated according to the law. They decided to apply for the Home Office scheme. And interestingly, Rowland describes those last days in Shepton Mallet prison before they were moved yet again as the worst days of the whole experience. And the reason he says that is that he was getting out of that particularly harsh system and leaving the other prisoners there, some of whom no doubt he'd got to know and befriend. So this time, having been accepted for that, they waited for transfer, and this time it was a single warder who escorted them to Dartmoor and hand over to the prison authorities there. Very different atmosphere there. Dartmoor had been set aside for conscientious objectors, and when Sidney and Rowland arrived, they were welcomed by two other prisoners who addressed them as comrade. He says obviously the prison buildings were very grim looking, and the extent of the war, he'd probably not spent a lot of time in wide open countryside up to that time. The extent of the war, of the moor, made them feel very isolated. And the whole place was obviously aimed at punishment, not reform. On the other hand, it was a different atmosphere because they were able to come and go from their cells as they pleased, except for times when they had to be locked up. They could walk to another hall to visit somebody. In their free time, they could explore part of the moor. But the warders and the various restrictions, the food and the nature of the work, he was always conscious of being a prisoner in a prison. And if you broke one of the rules, then you were very liable to be sent back to an ordinary prison. There were, he says, between 700 and 800 conscientious objectors at Dartmoor, engaged in non-military work, sewing mailbags, doing the laundry, running the kitchen, cleaning, maintenance. Outside, there was a prison gasworks, which is a bit surprising, and 2,000 acres of land including a quarry. So there was quite a variety of work, but it was hard work. The tools supplied were of the heaviest, clumsiest kind, and they had to, it was hard labor, for which they got paid 8 old pence a day. That's 3 1/3 new pence per day wages. What sounds the most interesting part of the experience was the evening program, where the activities included debates, vocal and instrumental music, and theatrical performances. Quite a few of the conscientious objector prisoners were in fact well-educated, artistic men, so they provided their own entertainment for the rest of the prisoners. So Rowland writes of his period in Dartmoor as being a wonderful experience. There was a deep sense of companionship, and all received a broadened outlook. And at the end of his memoir, he compares that experience with the extreme torture inflicted on some conscientious objectors who were sent to France, who were physically tortured there by crucifixion on a gun carriage wheel, and sentenced to death, although after a long pause, normally commuted to 10 years in prison. Rowland is very thankful that they were spared that ordeal. He gives thanks to God that he had the strength to bear witness to the teachings of Jesus. And then the memoir stops. There's no news about when he was released from Dartmoor, nor of his reunion with the family. And all I know is that he and Sydney formed a building firm after the war and built a number of houses in Knowe and perhaps elsewhere, probably including 25 Crowndale Road, which is a turning off the Wells Road, which is where Rowland lived, presumably with his family. And now comments. I think the account, if you read it, and I hope one day it will be available in the library of Central Meeting House, it very much understates the pain of the physical suffering and the hostility of friends and acquaintances. They were lucky in that they had a supportive family. In other cases, of course, the family was divided, and it was the young men against their parents or against one parent, which must have made it particularly difficult. I think probably Rowland also may have exaggerated the smoothness and self-confidence of his replies to interrogation. At the very first tribunal hearing in the Council House of Bristol, he was challenged over whether he would be willing to serve on a minesweeper, picking up mines, making the ocean safe. And he immediately comes up, apparently, with the reply, yes, I'd be happy to serve on a minesweeper, provided it picked up British mines as well as the enemy's. They couldn't guarantee that. Then I won't serve on a minesweeper. He has apparently thought all this out and has it ready for the answer. I think he may have stumbled a little bit more over some of these searching questions that he indicates. I think what comes out is that it's the strength of his conviction as a conscientious objector, as a pacifist, and presumably Sydney as well. And it's good that when he was able to explain his position, sometimes to teachers who'd been very hostile to him before he refused enlist to be conscripted. When he meets them afterwards, and of course they now know the enormous casualties on both sides of the First World War, they've got more sympathy for his position. Certainly some people's thinking the brothers were able to turn round by what they said in conversation. That's all I want to say, and as it's now 10 to 12, I stop. Paul, any comments?
Hello. Yes, I would go on to say that neither of the brothers put myself and my cousin Robert under any pressure at all, and left us to make up our own minds what we would do, because we were of service age at the end, right at the end of national service, as we had it in our generation. I think I was probably the last to register as a conscientious objector. Cousin Robert never had that because he was a little bit younger, and everything faded away after I went to the tribunal, which I went to with great trepidation, thinking likewise with the brothers Reinge, and I went there with great trepidation. But they hadn't burdened me with any of these things, and what you say today was unknown to me at the time until much later after the war. But when I went to the tribunal, it was a bit of a farce, because I was the only one there, apart from people onlooking and supporters and the family. And it was the tribunal was chaired by old Judge Weatherhead, an elderly judge, and I think, and he knew the case well. He knew the brothers Reinge and what they'd done, and I think he must have thought, "Oh grief, not another of them." And I'd just been doing 5 years on a construction course, so why would I want to learn anything about knocking things down? Anyway, he just said, "Carry on."
Carry on.
So the case was dismissed, and that was it. It was nothing to write home about, really.
Just a quickie, Paul. Who was Baden-Powell Reinge?
He was the third brother, the youngest brother. And he was young enough so that the time he came to service age as his brothers, the war was over, conscription had stopped, and conscription usually only went on after the Second World War, longer than the war. But in the First World War, I think it must have stopped with the end of the war completely. Anyway, he did not have to face a tribunal or any of the other problems, although he was in sympathy with his brothers. And they were very pleased because, of course, they were, for a lot of their sentences, they were together. They weren't isolated, whereas Baden would have been isolated completely on his own with no moral support at all.
Thank you.
Graham asks, I think, he didn't know what happened after the war with the two brothers. Well,
as I say, they never talked about it, and they never put myself and my cousin under any pressure. And they just didn't talk about it. We could ask them things about it, but we could tell that there was a certain amount of hurt there, and so we didn't press matters. They just got on with building houses. Yes, and they built quite a lot. Brislington and Knoll. Yes, mostly, I think.
Did they immediately decide to set up their own firm and work together, or did they try to get employment and find it difficult because of their anti-war record?
I don't know. They never discussed it. I would imagine that they were independently minded and very independent people.
Yeah.
And they decided that, well, you're a carpenter, let's go it alone. But Father, this is interesting on a humorous side. Father,
this is Sydney.
Father Sidney, yes, he is described on official documents as a grocer's assistant, very much like we get with David Jason in Open All Hours. Roland is described as a carpenter and joiner.
Yeah.
But Father, and I think Sidney was the brains behind the business and had all the drive, because he had the incentive. He had more properties. He bought more properties than Roland, and one of which was a farm, which is now called Withywood. And that was obviously to develop the business after the war, after the Second World War. Anyway, you know, that all came under compulsory purchase from the city council, and it's now a council estate. So, but the farm also served us very well because we were virtually evacuated there, self-evacuation, you might say, during the Second World War.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, it's really fascinating, the strength of their conviction and their ability to go through what they went through in what sounds like a very stoical way. You know, I think, you know, I try and think what I'd be like, and I think I would be would fail the test, have great difficulty. So it's a wonderful story, Graham. Thank you.
What interested me, I think, with one of them was that the quote was that in the last place they was at, they found most of them were very well educated. You know, that I think says something about the fact that, you know, if people are educated more, they're more likely to think for themselves and therefore, you know, be able to see war and conflict as something which harms everybody, and you know, they're not told exactly, you will do this by someone else, and you comply to doing it, type of thing. You know, it's have your own views, have your own ideas of what you want to think as.
I know it's very, very inspiring. Very. It's just, I mean, like David, I, you know, had I been a man and had I been called up in those ways, I don't know how I would have done. I don't know at all. I don't have too much faith in my own excellence under a lot of pressure. But it's inspiring all the same to learn of people who did. Thank you very much.
The Reinge brothers were not the only conscientious objectors at Friars meeting. I remember Christopher Cording was another. There were probably others whom we never met or knew about. Winchcombe Lansdowne at Bedminster meeting was a CO as well. I made a note from the complete list of Quaker conscientious objectors and found 20 that had lived in the area of Bedminster Meeting. So whenever you go walk along a rank of pre-First World War houses, there will be one or two houses there where a young man in 1916 had to face up to this challenge.
One thing I would point out there, Graham, is that Bedminster Meeting House in those days had been built. It was
Princess Street.
In Princess Street, that's right.
Yeah.
Which is now the shopping centre and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
I personally, I also find that impressive, the fact that someone of 16 is able to have such strong convictions and keep them. I think that's wonderful. It does show that they had, I think it must show they had a very good Quaker upbringing to give them that much courage at such a young age.
No, they weren't Quakers. My father didn't become a Quaker Sydney didn't become a Quaker until he was in his 60s, because he didn't think he was good enough. Roland was the Quaker, and he introduced the family. Roland introduced the family to Quakerism, brought them into it.
Right.
Yeah.
More impressive still, isn't it?
But, if anyone, as I say, Father and Roland didn't talk much about it. The experiences were perhaps too much for them, especially as they got older. We gleaned what we could from them, of their experiences. And if anybody wants to have a chat with me anytime, well, I'm about somewhere or other, and I'm quite happy. I might, if I can find it, I have got one picture, pre-war, pre-1914-18, of the brothers and sisters and the mother and father of that generation. It's an old sepia print. If I can find it, I think I will take it to what do you call it? I keep calling it Friars meeting. Of course, central meeting on Sunday, if I'm able to get there. Of course, I'm very, very old now and half crippled, and if it weren't for my trusty steed, I wouldn't get there. Yeah.
Maybe we can get photocopies of something of it done, and put it on the.
We could get photos taken off at London Camera Centre at the bottom of Park Street.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, I know we meant that.
Yes, opposite the old. Well, no, it's above it. The old Masons building.
Take your word for it. Any more questions and comments, friends? Well, thank you very much, David, for that. Graham, for that very, very interesting lecture on an area which I had only heard about, but now I am much further understand the privations which people went through at that time. And I turned to my lovely friend and colleague Patsy to say, what's going on next Friday, Patsy?
I'm afraid it's me next Friday, and I've used, in retrospect, what looks to me like a rather foolish title. It doesn't adequately explain, it doesn't explain at all what I'm going to talk about. I don't know what I was thinking about when I gave it the title out. What I want to be talking about, though, is not just my own experience, but that of other people I have worked with in the alcohol field, the things that make people stop you know, that when people are trying, because people are always trying to stop drinking, and the things that stop them trying, and they, as AA would say, slip, you know, they go back to drinking again. What other, I mean, in my own life, there were, I don't know, but let's guess at 10 times in 20 years that I really thought I'd made it, and I hadn't. And what's interesting is when I started to do the research into it, the way that, you know, matched with the experiences of other people, you know, how they would really have got all their ducks in a row, so to speak, and then all the ducks would fall off the end. And it's identifying the ducks that is really helpful. So that's, I think I ought to have called it Identifying the Ducks, in fact. So, but I do apologise for what's a very confusing title, and I will do my best with that next week. We've also got something a bit unexpected. The week after, we are having a talk by, oh golly, where's Susie's second name? Anyone got the sheet in front of them? It's going to be a talk on yoga, the philosophy of yoga. But the lady giving the talk can't get to us till 11:30. So a call is going out to all those who like yoga, experienced yoga, can talk about yoga, and we'll talk about yoga until she gets to us at 11:30. It's the best I could do with that. But I know that the talk will be good when she gets there. So,
yeah.
Okay.
Sounds very interesting. Right. Well, in that case, we will see you again, friends.
Oh, thanks.